The dust swirled around the wagon wheels as they rolled into the McAllister ranch, just as the sun began its descent behind the mesa. Sarah clutched the iron bars of her makeshift prison, her dark eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of hope. 3 days had passed since the Army patrol found her wandering the desert, half dead from thirst and exposure. They called her a savage, a threat to the settlers, but Sarah knew the truth. She was Running Brook, daughter of Chief White Eagle, and she had been searching for her missing brother when the soldiers captured her. The ranch foreman, a gruff man named Hayes, spat tobacco juice into the dirt as he approached the wagon. "Another one of them Apache," he muttered to the soldiers. "Boss says to put her in the holding pen with the others until the Indian agent comes next week." Sarah's heart sank. The holding pen was little more than a wooden cage where captured Apache were kept like animals before being shipped to the reservation. She had heard the stories from escaped prisoners who made it back to her village. Many never survived the journey, and those who did were broken in spirit. As the soldiers unlocked her restraints, Sarah's muscles screamed in protest. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the iron shackles, and her legs could barely support her weight. She stumbled as they pushed her toward the enclosure, but she refused to cry out. Her father had taught her that showing weakness to enemies only brought more suffering. The holding pen was worse than she had imagined. 23 Apache men, women, and children were crowded into a space meant for livestock. The stench of unwashed bodies and human waste filled the air. Some of the prisoners looked up as she was shoved inside, their faces hollow with despair. Others stared at the ground, their spirits already broken. An elderly woman named Gray Dove reached out to steady Sarah as she nearly collapsed. "Save your strength, young one," she whispered in their native tongue. "Death comes quick to those who fight too hard here." But Sarah could not accept defeat so easily. As night fell and the guards retired to the main house, she moved quietly among the other prisoners, listening to their stories and learning about the ranch's routines. She discovered that the owner, James McAllister, had lost his wife and young daughter in an Apache raid 5 years ago. Since then, he had become obsessed with capturing every Apache he could find, claiming it was justice for his family. The next morning brought new horrors. The guards separated the stronger men for forced labor in the fields, while the women and children were left to suffer in the blazing sun with only one bucket of water to share. Sarah watched as 2 young children grew weaker by the hour, their lips cracked and their eyes sunken. When she could stand it no longer, Sarah called out to the nearest guard. "Please, the little ones need more water. They will die." The guard laughed harshly. "Should have thought about that before your people started killing innocent folks." But someone else had heard her plea. A tall man emerged from the main house, his weather-beaten face marked by years of hard living under the desert sun. This was James McAllister himself, the man who held their lives in his hands. His cold blue eyes swept over the prisoners, lingering for a moment on Sarah's defiant face. "You speak English well for a savage," he said, his voice carrying no emotion. "I am not a savage," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I am Running Brook, daughter of Chief White Eagle, and these children are dying because of your cruelty." McAllister's jaw tightened at her words, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked back to the house, leaving Sarah to wonder if her boldness had only made things worse for everyone. As the day wore on, the heat became unbearable. The elderly and very young began showing signs of severe dehydration. Gray Dove collapsed near midday, her breathing shallow and labored. Sarah knelt beside her, using her own torn skirt to create shade for the old woman's face. It was then that she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Scratched into the wooden post near where Gray Dove lay were dozens of names, carved by previous prisoners who had died in this place. Her fingers traced the crude letters, reading the names of people she had known from her village. Her cousin, Laughing Wolf, who had disappeared 2 summers ago. Her childhood friend, Bright Star, who had vanished while gathering berries with her mother. Rage filled Sarah's chest like fire. These were not nameless savages, as the white men claimed. They were her people, her family, and they had died forgotten and alone in this terrible place. She stood up, her hands gripping the wooden bars of their prison, and called out again, "McAllister! Come face me if you have any honor left." This time, the ranch owner did not emerge. Instead, Hayes came stomping over, his face red with anger. "Shut your mouth, you heathen, or I'll shut it for you." "Then do it," Sarah challenged, pressing closer to the bars. "But know that when I die, I will carry the names of all who suffered here to the spirit world, and they will cry out for justice until the end of time." Hayes raised his hand to strike her, but a sharp command stopped him. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see McAllister standing nearby, though no one had heard him approach. His expression was unreadable as he studied Sarah's face. For a long moment, the only sounds were the labored breathing of the sick prisoners and the distant lowing of cattle. "Bring her some water," McAllister said finally. Hayes looked confused. "Boss, I thought you said—" "I said bring her water," McAllister repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. As Hayes reluctantly fetched a bucket, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since her capture, but she also sensed that something deeper was happening here, something connected to the pain she had glimpsed in McAllister's eyes when she mentioned his lost family. The water came, and Sarah immediately began sharing it with the weakest prisoners, starting with Gray Dove and the children. McAllister watched this without comment, but his expression had changed. The cold mask he wore seemed to crack slightly, revealing something unexpected underneath. That evening, as the desert air began to cool, McAllister returned to the holding pen. He stood outside the bars for several minutes, saying nothing. Finally, he spoke. "You said you were looking for someone when my men found you. Who?" Sarah hesitated. Answering might be a trap, but she sensed this was important somehow. "My brother, Soaring Eagle. He left our village 3 weeks ago to trade with the Mexicans and never returned. I followed his trail until the soldiers found me." McAllister nodded slowly. "And your father? This Chief White Eagle? He leads our band with wisdom and courage. He has never raised his hand against innocent people, only fought to protect our homes when attacked." "All Apache say the same thing," McAllister replied, but there was less conviction in his voice than before. Sarah moved closer to the bars. "And all white men claim they only want peace while they drive us from the lands where our ancestors are buried. But some truths cannot be hidden forever." James McAllister. "The spirits see everything, even into the hearts of those who pretend not to care." The use of his first name seemed to startle him. For just a moment, his carefully controlled facade slipped entirely, and Sarah saw the broken man underneath. A man who had lost everything that mattered to him and had spent 5 years trying to fill the emptiness with revenge. As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him, "Your wife and daughter, what were their names?" McAllister stopped walking but did not turn around. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mary and little Beth. Beth was only 7. Then know that Running Brook, daughter of White Eagle, honors their memory and grieves for your loss. No parent should outlive their child, no husband should lose his beloved. But making others suffer will not bring them back or heal your heart." This time, when McAllister walked away, his shoulders seemed to carry a heavier burden than before. Sarah pressed her face against the bars, watching his retreating figure and wondering if her words had reached the human being buried beneath all that pain and anger. The night that followed was the longest of Sarah's life. Several prisoners were clearly dying, including Gray Dove, whose breathing had become increasingly labored. Sarah sat with each of them in turn, singing the old songs and whispering prayers in the Apache tongue. She refused to let them die alone and forgotten. Near dawn, when the first light began to creep over the mountains, Sarah heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see McAllister standing outside the pen again. But this time he was not alone. Dr. Morgan, the local physician, was with him, carrying his medical bag. "Open it," McAllister said quietly to Hayes, who looked shocked. "Boss, are you sure about this?" "Open the pen." As the gate swung open, Dr. Morgan hurried inside to examine the sickest prisoners. Sarah watched in amazement as McAllister himself entered the enclosure, kneeling beside Gray Dove to help lift her head so the doctor could give her water mixed with medicine. For the first time since her capture, Sarah felt tears threaten to fall. But these were not tears of despair. They were tears of hope, born from the sight of a man who had chosen compassion over hatred, if only for this moment. The change in McAllister was subtle, but unmistakable. As Dr. Morgan worked to save what lives he could, the ranch owner quietly ordered more water, better food, and basic medical supplies for the prisoners. He said nothing to Sarah directly, but she caught him looking at her several times, as if trying to understand something that had previously escaped him. When the doctor finished his work and prepared to leave, McAllister walked him to his horse. Sarah strained to hear their conversation, catching only fragments carried on the morning breeze. "Never seen you show mercy to Apache before, James. Maybe it's time to start questioning what mercy really means. That girl, she's different somehow. They're all different when you look close enough to see them as people." As the sun climbed higher and the heat of another brutal day began to build, Sarah found herself facing an impossible situation. The small act of kindness had given her hope, but it had also created new dangers. If word spread that McAllister was showing mercy to Apache prisoners, it could bring trouble from other ranchers, the army, or even the territorial government. More importantly, she could sense the internal war raging within the man who held their lives in his hands. Years of hatred and pain could not be erased by a single moment of compassion. The question was whether that small spark of humanity would grow into something stronger, or whether it would be crushed by the weight of his past. As Gray Dove slowly regained consciousness thanks to the doctor's care, she grasped Sarah's hand weakly. "What did you say to the white man?" she whispered. "I have never seen one look upon us with anything but hatred." Sarah squeezed the old woman's hand gently. "I spoke to the part of him that remembers what it means to love someone more than life itself. Whether that part is strong enough to overcome his need for revenge, only time will tell." But time was something they might not have. Even as Dr. Morgan rode away and McAllister retreated to his house, Sarah could see Hayes and the other ranch hands gathered in angry discussion near the barn. Their faces told her everything she needed to know. They did not approve of their boss's sudden change of heart, and they would not hesitate to take matters into their own hands if they felt he was going soft on the enemy. The test of McAllister's resolve would come soon enough, and Sarah prayed that when it did, the man would prove stronger than the monster he had allowed grief to create. The confrontation Sarah had feared came at noon when the sun blazed directly overhead like an angry eye. Hayes approached the holding pen with 3 other ranch hands, their faces set with grim determination. Each man carried a rifle, and their intentions were clear even before Hayes spoke. "Time to end this nonsense," he declared loudly, making sure his voice carried to the main house. "Boss has gone soft, but we ain't forgot what these savages done to decent folk." Sarah immediately stepped forward, placing herself between the armed men and the weakest prisoners. "What do you want?" "Same thing we always wanted," Hayes sneered. "To see every last Apache dead or gone from this territory, starting with you, the one who's been filling McAllister's head with lies." Behind Sarah, the other prisoners began to stir with fear. Gray Dove struggled to sit up despite her weakness while mothers pulled their children closer. The men who were strong enough formed a protective circle around the most vulnerable, but they had no weapons and nowhere to run. McAllister gave his word that we would be turned over to the Indian agent, Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Are you calling your boss a liar? Hayes laughed harshly. McAllister ain't thinking straight since you started your medicine woman tricks on him. But don't worry, we'll set him right after we finish with you. The implications of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. These men were not just planning to murder the prisoners. They intended to remove McAllister as well if he tried to stop them. The ranch hands had clearly been discussing this among themselves, and they had decided that their boss's moment of compassion was a sign of dangerous weakness. You would kill your own leader? Sarah asked, genuinely shocked. The man who has fed and paid you for years? We'd be doing him a favor, another ranch hand replied, putting him out of his misery before he disgraces himself further by showing mercy to the ones who killed his family. It was then that Sarah realized the true tragedy of the situation. McAllister's moment of humanity had not just endangered the prisoners, it had revealed how completely hatred had poisoned the hearts of everyone around him. These men could no longer recognize compassion as strength. To them, it could only be weakness or madness. As Hayes raised his rifle, Sarah heard the sound of boots crunching on gravel. McAllister appeared around the corner of the barn, moving with the measured pace of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed from it. Stand down, he ordered, his voice carrying absolute authority. Hayes turned to face his boss, the rifle still pointed at Sarah. Sorry, McAllister, but we can't let you make this mistake. These Apache killed your wife and daughter. Have you forgotten that? I haven't forgotten anything, McAllister replied calmly. But I'm beginning to remember some things I lost along the way. Like what? Hayes demanded, anger creeping into his voice. Like the fact that Mary would be ashamed of what I've become. That little Beth would be horrified to see her father keeping children in cages. McAllister's voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the pain beneath his words. Like the truth that revenge never brought anyone back from the dead. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed to vibrate like heat waves. The other ranch hands shifted nervously, unsure whether to support Hayes or their boss. Sarah could see the calculation in their eyes as they weighed loyalty against their hunger for Apache blood. Hayes's face twisted with disgust. They've bewitched you somehow, made you forget you're a white man with obligations to your own kind. My only obligation right now is to my conscience, McAllister replied, and it's telling me that what we've been doing here is wrong. Wrong? Hayes's voice rose to a shout. They're savages. Animals. They killed innocent women and children. So have we, McAllister said quietly, and his words fell like stones into still water. Look around you, Hayes. Look at what we've done. How many innocent Apache women and children have died in this pen? How many old people and babies have we let suffer for crimes they never committed? Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. The man standing up to his own workers bore little resemblance to the cold, bitter rancher who had imprisoned her. This was someone who had found the courage to confront his own darkness, even though it meant risking everything he had built. But Hayes was too far gone to hear reason. You're talking like one of them Indian lovers from back east. Next thing you'll be wanting to give them our land and apologize for fighting back when they attacked us. I'm talking like a man who's tired of living with hate eating him alive from the inside, McAllister answered. I'm talking like someone who finally understands that Mary and Beth would want me to honor their memory by being better than the men who killed them, not by becoming just like them. The mention of his family seemed to inflame Hayes even further. Don't you dare speak their names while defending these murdering savages! He swung his rifle toward McAllister, but the ranch owner was ready. Years of frontier living had kept him quick despite his grief, and he drew his pistol before Hayes could complete the motion. The two men faced each other across 10 feet of dusty ground, weapons trained on one another, while the other ranch hands watched in shock. "I'm giving you one chance to ride out of here," McAllister said. "Take anyone who agrees with you and find another place to spread your poison. But these prisoners stay alive until the Indian agent arrives." "You've lost your mind," Hayes snarled, "but I ain't the only one who sees it. Tell him, boys." The other ranch hands looked at each other uncertainly. Clearly, they had not expected their foreman to draw down on their boss. The situation had escalated beyond anything they were prepared for. One of them, a younger man named Pete, slowly shook his head. "I don't like Apache much as anyone, Hayes, but I ain't shooting Mr. McAllister. He's been fair to me and mine." "And I got a family to feed," added another. "Can't afford to lose this job over your grudge." Hayes looked around desperately as his support crumbled. "You're all fools! When word gets out that McAllister's protecting Apache, every rancher in the territory will turn against us. The army will investigate. We'll all be ruined." "Maybe," McAllister agreed, "but we'll be ruined as men, not as animals." For a moment it seemed like Hayes might back down. His rifle wavered slightly as he realized he stood alone. But then his eyes found Sarah again, and all the hatred of years focused into a single point of burning rage. "This is your fault," he hissed at her. "You put some kind of spell on him, made him forget his duty to his own people." Sarah stepped forward despite the danger, moving close enough to the bars that Hayes could have shot her easily. "I cast no spells except the truth. Your boss remembered what it means to be human instead of a monster. If that seems like magic to you, perhaps you should ask yourself what kind of man you've become." Hayes's finger tightened on the trigger, and Sarah saw her death in his eyes. But before he could fire, McAllister spoke again. "The first shot you fire at her, I put a bullet in you. That's a promise." The standoff stretched out like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, and the shallow breathing of terrified prisoners behind her. Even the cattle in the distance seemed to sense the tension, their lowing fading to an eerie silence. Finally, Hayes slowly lowered his rifle. "This ain't over, McAllister. Word will spread about what you've done here. Mark my words, you'll pay for choosing them over your own kind." "I didn't choose them over anyone," McAllister replied. "I chose right over wrong, something you might try sometime." Hayes spat in the dirt at his feet and turned to the other ranch hands. "Any man who stays here is a traitor to his own race. When the Apache come for revenge, don't expect me to help defend this place." But none of the other workers moved to follow him. They watched in uncomfortable silence as Hayes stomped toward the barn to gather his belongings. Within an hour, he had loaded his gear onto a horse and ridden away, leaving a cloud of dust and bitter words hanging in the air. After he was gone, McAllister holstered his pistol and approached the holding pen. For the first time since Sarah had been imprisoned, he came close enough to the bars that she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the weight of the decision he had just made. "I won't pretend this changes everything," he said quietly, speaking directly to Sarah. "There's still a lot of hate in this territory, and word of what happened here will spread like wildfire. The Indian agent might not even make it through safely when he comes for you." "But you will try to protect us until then?" Sarah asked. McAllister nodded slowly. "I'll try, though I can't promise it will be enough." Sarah reached through the bars, her fingers just touching his sleeve. The gesture seemed to surprise him, but he didn't pull away. "It is enough that you try. Your wife and daughter can rest peacefully, knowing that their husband and father found his way back to the man they loved." For a moment, McAllister's carefully controlled expression cracked, and Sarah saw the depth of the grief he still carried. But she also saw something else, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. The possibility of healing. the chance to build something better from the ruins of his shattered life. "What happens now depends on forces beyond this ranch," he said finally. "But I give you my word that no one else will die in this pen while I draw breath." As he walked back toward the house, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the immediate danger had passed, gratitude for McAllister's change of heart, but also deep concern for what would come next. Hayes had been right about one thing. Word of McAllister's protection of Apache prisoners would spread, and it would bring consequences that none of them could fully predict. That evening, as the prisoners shared a better meal than they had seen since their capture, Grey Dove pulled Sarah aside. "You have done something remarkable here, young one, but I fear the real test is yet to come." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon where dust clouds spoke of riders approaching in the distance. "I know, but sometimes the greatest victories are not in avoiding the battle, but in choosing which side of the battle represents your true self." The riders were still too far away to identify, but they were coming fast and with purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of McAllister's resolve, and new opportunities for both redemption and tragedy. As night fell over the ranch, Sarah found herself praying to the spirits of her ancestors for wisdom and strength. She had managed to touch the humanity in one man's heart, but that was only the beginning. The true measure of her success would be whether that small flame of compassion could survive the storm that was coming. The riders arrived with the dawn, their horses lathered with sweat from a hard night's journey. Sarah counted 12 men, heavily armed and grim-faced, led by a weathered rancher she recognized as Tom Bradley from the neighboring spread. Behind him rode Deputy Marshal Johnson from town, his badge glinting in the early morning sun. McAllister met them at the ranch gate, flanked by his remaining workers. The tension was so thick Sarah could feel it from her position in the holding pen 200 yards away. Even without hearing their words, she could read the confrontation in their body language and gestures. Grey Dove struggled to stand beside her, still weak from her recent illness, but determined to witness whatever was about to unfold. "They have come to force his hand," the old woman whispered, "to make him choose between his newfound conscience and his place in this white world." Sarah nodded grimly. She had expected this moment since Hayes rode away yesterday. In a territory where Apache were seen as less than human, any white man who showed them mercy would be viewed as a traitor to his own people. McAllister's protection of the prisoners had marked him as dangerous in the eyes of his neighbors. The heated discussion at the gate continued for nearly an hour. Sarah watched McAllister's shoulders set with stubborn determination as Bradley gestured angrily toward the holding pen. The deputy marshal seemed to be trying to mediate, but his efforts appeared futile against the rising tide of anger from the other ranchers. Finally, the group began walking toward the pen, their boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. McAllister led the way, his face set like stone, while Bradley and the others followed close behind. Sarah could see the weapons they carried openly, a clear message about their intentions. "Running Brook!" Bradley called out as they approached, using her Apache name with obvious distaste. "You've caused quite a stir for a savage." Sarah moved to the front of the pen, meeting his hostile gaze without flinching. "I have done nothing but ask for water for dying children and speak truth to a man with ears to hear it." "Truth?" Bradley laughed harshly. "The only truth about Apache is that you're killers and thieves who need to be wiped out or locked away where you can't hurt decent folk." "And what makes you decent?" Sarah asked quietly. "The fact that you keep children in cages? That you let old women die of thirst while you drink your fill? That you judge an entire people by the actions of a few?" Bradley's face darkened with rage. "Don't you lecture me about decency, girl. Your people killed my brother and his whole family 3 years back, burned them out, and left nothing but ashes and bones." Sarah felt the familiar weight of collective guilt that her people had carried for generations. Every Apache was held responsible for every crime committed by any Apache, while white men were judged only as individuals. But she refused to accept the logic of hatred. And do you hold every white man responsible when soldiers massacre innocent Apache villages? When ranchers poison water holes or burn sacred burial grounds? Or is collective punishment only for people with skin like mine? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Even some of Bradley's own men shifted uncomfortably at the challenge to their double standard. But the rancher himself was too consumed with rage to hear the wisdom in her words. "Enough of this," he snarled, turning to McAllister. "You've let this savage twist your thinking, James, but it ends now. We're taking all these Apache to town for immediate transport to the reservation. No more delays, no more excuses." McAllister stepped between Bradley and the pen. "They stay here until the Indian agent arrives as planned." That was the agreement with the territorial authorities. "Agreements change when circumstances change," Deputy Marshal Johnson spoke for the first time. "There's been talk of Apache raids picking up again. Some folks think keeping this many of them in one place is too dangerous." Sarah could see the political calculation behind the marshal's words. Public opinion was turning against McAllister, and the law was bending to accommodate popular sentiment rather than justice. It was an old story that her people knew all too well. "What raids?" McAllister demanded. "I haven't heard reports of any recent Apache attacks." Bradley and the marshal exchanged a meaningful look. "Well, there was that incident over at the Peterson place last week," Bradley said carefully. "Stock went missing. Tracks led toward Apache territory." "Missing stock isn't a raid," McAllister replied, "and tracks can be made by anyone who knows how." The implication of his words was clear, and it sent a ripple of anger through the assembled ranchers. He was suggesting that the evidence might be manufactured, that desperate men might create justification for the violence they wanted to commit anyway. "Are you calling us liars?" one of the other ranchers demanded. "I'm saying that fear and hatred make men see things that aren't there," McAllister answered calmly. "And I'm saying that innocent people shouldn't die because of our fears." Sarah felt a surge of pride at his words, but also deep concern for his safety. He was outnumbered 12-1, and his workers clearly had divided loyalties. If the situation turned violent, there would be little she could do to help him from inside the pen. Bradley stepped closer to McAllister, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You've gone soft, James. These savages have poisoned your mind somehow, but we're not leaving here without them, one way or another." "Then you'll have to go through me," McAllister replied simply. The words carried absolute finality, and Sarah realized with a mixture of admiration and terror that he meant them completely. This man who had lost everything to Apache raiders was now prepared to die defending Apache prisoners. The transformation was so complete it seemed almost miraculous. But miracles, Sarah knew, often came with terrible costs. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed if not for the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, approaching at a measured pace that suggested official business rather than hostile intent. As he drew closer, Sarah could see the distinctive uniform of an Indian agent, complete with the badge of authority that would be recognized throughout the territory. Agent William Crawford was a thin, scholarly-looking man who carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to difficult situations. He dismounted near the gate and approached the gathered men with the wary caution of a man who understood that his arrival might not be welcomed by everyone present. "Gentlemen," he said formally, tipping his hat, "I understand there's been some discussion about the disposition of Apache prisoners being held here." Bradley turned toward the newcomer with barely concealed frustration. "You're early, Crawford. We weren't expecting you until next week." "Plans change," Crawford replied mildly. "I received word that the situation here might require immediate attention. Something about concerns for the prisoners' welfare and disputes over their custody." Sarah caught the slight emphasis on welfare and realized that someone had sent word to the Indian agent about conditions at the ranch, possibly Dr. Morgan, who had witnessed the suffering in the holding pen firsthand. The thought that outside authorities were aware of their situation gave her the first real hope she had felt in days. Crawford approached the pen and began examining the prisoners with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many similar situations. His expression grew increasingly grim as he noted their condition, the overcrowding, and the inadequate facilities. "How long have these people been held here?" he asked McAllister. "Most of them for several weeks. The young woman there was brought in 3 days ago." Crawford's gaze fixed on Sarah, and she could see intelligence and sympathy in his eyes. "And their treatment?" McAllister hesitated, clearly unwilling to condemn his own past actions, but equally unwilling to lie. "It has improved recently." "I can see that," Crawford said dryly, noting the fresh water and medical supplies that had been provided. "But I can also see evidence of considerable suffering. This facility is not suitable for human habitation." Bradley stepped forward aggressively. "These ain't humans, Crawford. They're Apache, and they're lucky to be alive at all after what their people have done to innocent settlers." Crawford turned to face the rancher with calm authority. "Mr. Bradley, I am a federal agent acting under the authority of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. These prisoners are under my jurisdiction now, and I will determine their treatment according to federal law, not local prejudices." The quiet rebuke carried the weight of government backing, and even Bradley seemed to recognize that he was treading on dangerous ground. Interfering with a federal agent in the performance of his duties was a serious crime that could bring unwanted attention from Washington. "What do you intend to do with them?" Deputy Marshal Johnson asked. Crawford studied the prisoners for a long moment before answering. "First, I'm going to provide immediate medical attention for those who need it. Then I'm going to investigate their individual circumstances and determine which ones are actually hostile and which ones are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time." Sarah felt her heart leap at his words. The possibility of individual evaluation meant that some of them might avoid the horror of forced relocation to the reservation. More importantly, it meant that someone in authority was willing to see them as people rather than a faceless enemy. "You can't just release Apache back into the wild," Bradley protested. "They'll rejoin their tribes and come back to raid us." "Mr. Bradley," Crawford said patiently, "not every Apache is a raider, just as not every white man is a rancher. Some of these people may be peaceful traders, others might be refugees from conflicts they had nothing to do with. My job is to separate the innocent from the guilty, not to condemn an entire race for the crimes of a few." The agent's words echoed Sarah's own arguments, but coming from a federal official, they carried a weight that her pleas had lacked. She could see the frustration on the ranchers' faces as their simple solution of mass punishment was challenged by legal authority. Crawford began interviewing prisoners individually, starting with Gray Dove and the other elders who could provide context for the others' situations. Sarah watched anxiously as he took detailed notes about each person's circumstances, their tribal affiliations, and how they had come to be captured. When he finally reached her, his questions were thorough but respectful. "Tell me about yourself, miss. Your name, your family, and how you came to be here." Sarah told him her story honestly, describing her search for her missing brother and her capture by the Army patrol. She spoke of her father's peaceful leadership and her band's efforts to avoid conflict with white settlers. Throughout her account, Crawford took careful notes and asked clarifying questions that showed he was genuinely listening. "And this brother you were searching for," Crawford said. "Soaring Eagle, you said? Can you describe him?" Sarah provided a detailed description, including the distinctive silver bracelet her brother wore and the trading goods he had been carrying. Something about Crawford's reaction suggested the information might be significant. "I may have information about your brother. the agent said quietly. A young Apache man matching that description was found dead near the Mexican border 2 weeks ago. It appeared he had been killed by bandits who took his trade goods. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known in her heart that something terrible had happened to Soaring Eagle, but hearing the confirmation was still devastating. Tears she had held back for days finally began to fall as she grieved for her brother and for her father, who would be waiting for news that would never come. Crawford waited respectfully for her to compose herself before continuing. "I'm sorry for your loss, but this information supports your story and explains why you were found alone in the desert. You were not raiding or scouting for raiders. You were a sister searching for her lost brother." Behind them, Bradley and his men listened to this exchange with obvious displeasure. The humanization of the Apache prisoners was making their position increasingly difficult to justify. How could they demand mass punishment when faced with individual stories of loss and innocence? As the day progressed, Crawford's investigation revealed that more than half of the prisoners were non-combatants who had been captured while engaged in peaceful activities. Gray Dove and her family had been gathering medicine plants when soldiers found them. A group of young men had been hunting deer to feed their starving band. 2 women had been visiting relatives in a different tribe when violence broke out elsewhere. By evening, Crawford had made his decision. "I will be releasing 13 of these prisoners immediately, as they pose no threat to local communities and have committed no crimes. The remaining 10 will be transported to the reservation, but under humane conditions with proper food, water, and medical care." Sarah found herself among those to be released, along with Gray Dove and most of the women and children. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by sorrow for those who would still face the uncertain fate of reservation life. McAllister approached her as Crawford prepared the release documents. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you as a person instead of an enemy," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry for your brother." Sarah reached through the bars one last time to touch his hand. "You found your way back to the man your family loved. That is all anyone can ask for. And perhaps some good can come from all this suffering." "What do you mean?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Your ranch will need workers now that Hayes and his hatred are gone. There are Apache who would work for fair wages and honest treatment, men and women who could help you build something better than what hate created here." McAllister considered her words for a long moment. "You think peaceful coexistence is possible after everything that's happened?" "I think it is the only thing that honors the memory of those we have lost," Sarah replied. "Your Mary and Beth, my brother Soaring Eagle, all the others who died in this cycle of revenge. They deserve better from us than more killing." As the gates of the pen finally opened and Sarah stepped into freedom, she felt the weight of her ordeal lifting from her shoulders. But she also carried with her the knowledge that she had witnessed something rare and precious, the moment when a man chose love over hate, hope over despair, and humanity over the easy comfort of prejudice. The other ranchers rode away in angry frustration, but they rode away defeated. Crawford's federal authority had trumped their local hatred, and McAllister's transformation had shown that even the most bitter hearts could find redemption. It was a small victory in a vast territory still torn by conflict, but it was a victory nonetheless. As Sarah prepared to begin the long journey home to her father's band, she turned back once more to look at the ranch that had been her prison and nearly her grave. The holding pen stood empty now, its gates open to the desert wind. But more importantly, the man who had built it in his grief had found the courage to tear it down in his wisdom. She would carry that lesson with her always, along with the memory of the moment when kindness proved stronger than hatred, and one broken soul found healing by helping to heal others. In a world too often darkened by prejudice and fear, such moments were like stars in the night sky, distant but brilliant enough to guide travelers home.